Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here. And I am going to talk a little bit about mostly work that I've been doing with the Indo-Fijian community in Fiji, with just a little bit of context about the other population of indigenous Fijians in the country. So I'll give you an introduction to what I'm going to be telling you about, all about the Fiji Islands, and a really light speed overview of urbanization, parental investment, and nutrition transition, trying to make some linkages here grounded in human behavioral ecology, and then discuss one research question in particular, give you a summary of the results that I have so far, and some tentative conclusions, and maybe if we have time, a short statement or two about future directions of the work. So I think most of you are somewhat familiar with Fiji. Many of you are probably very familiar with Fiji. So I'll give you just the basics. Fiji is a small island nation, about 5,000 square miles off the southwest coast of Hawaii in the South Pacific. It's about 330 small islands, but only about 100 of them are inhabited, with most of the Indo-Fijian population that I'll speak about today being only found on the two main islands. That's Viti Levu and Vanua Levu. The capital is Suva. Suva is also the most densely populated area of the country. Fiji has a very long colonial history, with first contact happening in the mid-1600s, sugar plantation economy cropping up in the mid-1800s, and Britain's interest being spurred on by the potential for a lucrative sugarcane colony. Fiji became a British colony in 1874 and remained a British colony for almost 100 years, achieving independence very recently in 1970. The population is still rather small. The latest census figures are from 2007, and those are, 837,000 or so people. More than half the population is indigenous, or what the latest census figures are calling itokai, of the land, indigenous native people, with 37% being of Indian origin. These figures have changed dramatically since 2000. In 2000, the Indo-Fijian population actually constituted more than half of the population of the country. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. 51% of the population in Fiji is urban. The country is quickly urbanizing. The urban population is stilted toward Indo-Fijian, with almost 60% of Indo-Fijians being urban living, and not quite 50% of indigenous Fijians living in urban areas. In terms of religion, Indo-Fijians are almost primarily Hindu. There is a large sample of Muslims in the country. Indigenous Fijians, I think it's fair to say, are universally Christian, a result of their colonial legacy. And the official language in Fiji is English, but for any of you that have worked there, you'll know that speaking English doesn't get you very far in terms of doing anthropology. The Indian-descended peoples tend to speak a dialect of Hindi first off and learn English later, and indigenous people tend to speak one of 30 or so dialects of Fijian. So you can tell from the graph there that the population has been changing, with itokai, or indigenous people, increasing proportionately as Indians leave the country and reduce their birth rates. On the little map here, this shows you all of Fiji. The 4 red stars represent the areas where I work. I'm actually going to be talking to you only about Suva, which is the capital here, and Reki in the northern part of the island right there. The other 2 areas are areas that I work in with indigenous peoples. Just a slight bit of background about indigenous Fijians. They are separate and distinct from Indo-Fijians, and I'll spend the majority of the talk today talking about Indo-Fijians. Fijians are communal. They live in traditional village, kin-based village groups. They practice patrilineal descent and patrilocal residence. They have really still quite clear gender roles, and when you're in urban areas, those do blur a bit, but once you get outside the real core urban area of Suva, you really do still have distinct gender roles. Indigenous people are quite literally tied to the land in Fiji. The word vanua means land, like the physical land that you walk on, but it also connotes social and cultural systems, people's beliefs, people's customs, people's attitudes and values about their own life and livelihood. Indigenous people are tied to the land formally as well, which I'll talk about in just a second. Most of this strong tie to the land comes out of both cultural tradition and also colonial legacies, which reinforced that, laws that tied people to village land, indigenous people to village land, and locked the Indians out of any land, village land especially, but almost all land ownership entirely. Indians in Fiji came during the colonial period, beginning in 1879 after the first colonial governor instituted legislation for sugarcane labor that required indigenous people to stay in their village outside of sugarcane plantation farming, and imported 60,000 or so indentured Indian laborers. They came for a 5-year term, and after the end of that 5 years of sugarcane labor, they could either choose to stay in Fiji or work another 5 years and earn passage back to India. For a variety of reasons that I won't go into, the vast majority of them continued to stay. And by about 1920, almost all of them that stayed were free living, working in agriculture. Because of the colonial system and the land regulations that were passed by the first colonial governor, Arthur Gordon, the land boundaries in the country at the time of colonialization were codified based on village statements, village designations, village land ownership. And those boundaries were set down as inalienable ownership, and all village land was made inalienably kin group owned. And that constitutes 83% of the total land in Fiji, and about 10% that is government owned. So only about 8% of the land in the entire country can be bought or sold as freehold land by anyone who's not born indigenous Fijian. So the Indians who were living in Fiji as sugarcane farmers began leasing land through a very complicated system set up by the Native Land Trust Board. These leases were long-term leases of 2 to 99 years, most of them being in the range of 30 years, and they've all been expiring since the late 1960s. And because of inter-ethnic relationships, landowners, being the Fijian people who don't farm, at least don't cash crop farm, and Indians being the cash crop farmers, and the deep divisions, ethnic divisions between these two populations, there's been a movement that's grown since 2000 to evict farmers once their land leases expire, and most of these farmers don't have many other options in the rural area, and it spurs migration into the urban area. It's been called the most important threat facing this population during this period of time. A couple more notes about land and politics in Fiji. The native land regulations that were passed during the colonial period are still very much intact. Indigenous identity was a traditional value that the colonial government chose to protect instead of dismantle, and but that legacy of protection has been maintained. By law, at birth, all indigenous Fijians are entitled to be enrolled into the Native Land Register. And they had a study in 2012 looking for natives that were not literally at birth written into their native land ownership group. And they found some 20,000 people in the country or so that were not literally written down, legally entitled to own land by birthright. Of course, that is only indigenous people, not any non-indigenous person, and so the entire population of Indian people is basically locked out of any of this type of land ownership, and Vanua has really become a motivating force in politics. Fiji has had 4 political coups. They're on their 4th one currently, 2 in 1987, and these have all been motivated by racial and resource issues, specifically land. In the 1987 coups, and they were back-to-back, were perpetrated to safeguard Fijian land issues and the Fijian way of life. The 1987 coups were not terribly long-lived, and they weren't brutal on the spectrum of political coups at all. The 2000 coup was much worse for Indian people, and it was perpetrated for similar reasons. In 2000, the Indo-Fijians represented more than 50% of the population, and they elected their first Indian prime minister. The military promptly overthrew the government, saying Fiji is not yet ready for an Indian prime minister. They threw the constitution out, rewrote it, codifying indigenous affirmative action and land rights. And in 2006, Bainimarama, the military dictator here, took over. He gave a year's notice that if the Constitution was not rid of racial politics and racial affirmative action, that he would overthrow the government in an effort to equalize ethnic and racial tensions and rights in the country. There's been no mention of equalizing land ownership rights, so far this has not really been very effective. I think for the sake of time, I'll spare you this, except to say that indigenous Fijians are subsistence village, kin-based, communal individuals that are locked into the land at birth. If they migrate sort of from the rural area to the urban area, stay for a while, and often return, often engaging in some level of circular migration only as their economic needs require. Indian people, however, have a history of cash cropping, wage earning. They don't have outlets outside the modern economy. They have very uncertain long-term land ownership, and they tend to migrate in permanent ways. They either migrate to urban areas and stay there, or migrate from urban to other urban areas, or even migrate outside the country to Australia, New Zealand, Canada, etc. So in terms of thinking about Fiji and what I'm going to talk about today, it's important to talk a little bit about what it means to be urban. Urbanization is something that we know is going on throughout the world today. We hear about it described as perhaps the largest demographic phenomenon facing populations in the world today. But defining what it means to be urban is really problematic. The definition of urban is quite variable. It's country specific, so comparing across countries can be extremely problematic. Urban areas themselves are incredibly heterogeneous. Urban areas are not just sort of dichotomous rural urban and one-size-fits-all urban. They actually have a vast amount of heterogeneity in them, no matter what factors you're looking at. Migration patterns are very complex. People are flowing into urban areas throughout the world, and the way people migrate, whether it's permanent, circular, etc., is exceedingly complex as well. And then finally, perhaps the biggest problem, and the one that motivates this talk, is that if something is not classified as urban, it's automatically classified as rural. And I think most of us know that that's not how landscapes look. They don't just sort of stop at an urban perimeter and break into a rural landscape. There's usually a shifting peri-urban perimeter in between urban cores and rural landscapes. So urbanization is going on very rapidly in the world today. We've seen a 72%, or expect to see a 72% increase between the year 2000 and 2030. And this is mainly happening in areas of the world that already have 100,000 or more people, but not mega cities. A lot of cities under 500,000 people are being affected. The urban world population was about 30% of the global population in 1950. It hit 47% in 2001. About half the world was urban living in 2008. And they expect by 2030 a good 60%, and those estimates keep being revised up, are expected to be urban living. The majority of this change will take place in the developing world. We'll see just a fraction of an increase in developed countries. They expect by 2025, and again, they're sort of pushing the boundary on that. They may actually begin to revise this estimate down, that global rural population growth will cease by 2025. And this is the first time in human history that we've ever seen something like this. It's certainly not because rural people are having fewer and fewer offspring. In fact, it's the opposite. Urban people tend to have fewer offspring. But rural people tend to leave rural areas, moving into urban areas, and that that outflow creates, or will create very soon, a net negative rural population growth. So urban transition then is this passage of all of these factors ongoing through which a society travels when they go from predominantly rural to a predominantly urban society. At the top there you see a traditional Fijian bure, how people in Fiji actually still live today, compared to downtown Suva, which is, as I said, the most urban area of the country where a lot of these data come from. So the question is then, why do people move to cities? Why would people migrate from, I would say by most measures, a pretty good standard of living? Despite rural poverty, village life is quite nice. Cash crop farming might not be quite as nice, depending on the rent and things like that that people have to pay. But people are moving to cities in droves. Cities are thought by most people, and certainly we see it in economic figures, to contribute to national economies. They offer variable and often better options for employment, education, services like health services. And in terms of what's going on in Fiji, there's often a stripping of rural land resources or land insecurity. And in the rural area, especially with urbanization, a lot of human capital gets motivated by urban cores, and so rural areas tend to just be depleted in what little additional economic access there is outside of land-based farming, something like that. Of course, when people transition to urban areas, it changes the parenting context. We've heard several or read several papers looking at sort of an embodied capital approach to parental investment and demographic change. Parenting gets changed through several alleys. The value of education changes, increases, especially for girls, especially in areas where maybe employment was primarily by males. The value of education for girls, and we see this happening in many contexts throughout the world, increases. The options for wage employment increase when you're in the city. Fertility changes. We usually see a decrease in fertility with urban living, and that's generally linked to the fact that it costs more to raise kids. Parental investment costs are increased. And we see variable dietary choices that have been summed up through the phenomenon of nutrition transition. So, nutrition transition. I'm not going to belabor this because I figure we probably have a good idea about what nutrition transition is. I'll just give you the basics as it is pertinent to the talk. So nutrition transition is a very broad term that is supposed to encompass all the patterns of historical dietary change through time. And I've just added stage 1 and stage 2 to the stage 3, 4, and 5 graphic. Stage 1 would have been the first transition to from hunter-gathering to farming, collecting food, that sort of thing, farming from collecting food. And on we would go from there until stage 4, which is where we are now. Some countries like the United States are transitioning from a stage 4 to a stage 5 nutrition transition. Most countries in the world, however, are moving through stage 4, which is a period of receding famine, to obesity-related, non-communicable, nutrition-related diseases, degenerative diseases, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease. And this is happening in concert with urbanization. And of course, nutrition transition is thought to still be going on in most countries, with the United States and Britain moving from 4 to 5, where behavioral changes are starting to plateau or reduce obesity and obesity-related diseases on a population level. So the prevailing view of this nutrition transition is often summated by talking about an obesity epidemic. And this is from the World Health Organization. You usually hear large-scaled population statistics and public health rhetoric about nutrition transition. They say changes in the world food economy have contributed to shifting dietary patterns. For example, increased consumption of energy-dense diets high in fat, particularly saturated fat, and low in refined carbohydrates. These patterns are combined with a decline in energy expenditure that is associated with a sedentary lifestyle, motorized transport, labor-saving devices at home, phasing out of physically demanding manual tasks in the workplace, and leisure time that is predominantly devoted to physically undemanding pastimes. And I've just highlighted lifestyle here because I kind of feel like all of these things are sort of aspects of an urban lifestyle that we see as potential explanatory factors for the uptick in obesity and obesity-related diseases in urban areas. But I don't think that we really understand what motivates a lot of the dietary choices going on in countries that are entering or proceeding through their own nutrition transition. So just because it might be pertinent, I thought you might want to see some of the rates of overweight and obesity in Fiji. Fiji is, I should have said, keeping pace with those urbanization trends. It is right on the mark in terms of population percentages that are urbanizing, moving to the urban area. And in terms of nutrition transition, Fiji is right in bounds with the transition as well. So one question I always get is, well, those rates don't seem very high. So these are adult rates starting at age 18. The data that I'll show you today only goes up to age 16. And most of the data coming out of Fiji about children is organized in percentages. So we're still seeing children that show stunting and wasting, so diseases of undernutrition, but the rates are quite low relative to what you might expect from a developing country. And those rates of underweight decrease as children age, and they move into this track when they reach adulthood with rates increasing. Bear in mind that I'm also going to talk only about Indo-Fijian children today. Most of the countrywide statistics that you find are combined Indian and South Pacific Islander statistics, so it can be very difficult to parcel out those statistics by rural, urban, and by ethnicity. But suffice to say, overweight is increasing, especially among children, especially among adults. Women bear the larger burden of obesity and obesity-related diseases. So, all of that background. I'm actually going to try to link some of those things to life history theory and behavioral ecology. So, again, just the basics of life history theory that apply to this talk. We all know that life history theory describes the evolution of characteristics that shape patterns of allocation. Energy, or we could say all resources, are limited, and those patterns of allocation are expected to be adapted to socio-ecological conditions. The resources that parents direct to offspring can be considered parental investments. And in terms of fertility and parental investment, two fundamental trade-offs apply. The first is current versus future reproduction, and the second is the quality-quantity trade-off. As a behavioral ecologist, we can assume that making these trade-off decisions relies on an evolved psychology that should be somehow sensitive to ecological variations in opportunities and payoffs. And again, going back to sort of an embodied capital approach to this, we recognize that modern environments create new, variably accessible opportunities. And those opportunities enhance the potential payoffs to parental investments in quality. That type of child rearing strategy, a strongly quality-based one, increases the cost of child rearing because as the average level of investment in survival or income increases, the production of each of those offspring will be more costly. And in terms of the parental investment and fertility trade-offs, I think both of those will bear on the discussion and conclusion section. So from a life history perspective, how is urbanization associated with nutrition transition? So I've said that most of the nutrition, I would say the vast majority of nutrition transition literature comes out of a public health perspective. There's a lot of correlational data associating nutrition transition, increases in obesity with urban environments. And we know that nutrition transition proceeds variably across space, across time. The pace at which it's proceeding can be very fast, as we're seeing today in many countries, or it can be very prolonged, like it was in the United States and other developed economies. So you might sum up one of the murky summaries of nutrition transition as nutrition transition can be seen as a complex intertwining of economic and social conditions that creates rapid transition among some suburban populations, some urban subpopulations. As a behavioral ecologist, I might sum that up slightly differently. I might say nutrition transition is newly emergent. Nutrition transition is a newly emergent dietary variability associated with individual and ecological factors, including resource availability and parental investment motives, in concert with economic and urban transition. Trying to unpack those a little bit to sort of isolate what motivates dietary changes in economies or urban economies. So in terms of the data, I'm going to present some data in the present analysis. It's all data from children. The data were collected in 2 field sites, Reki, which is the rural field site. It is about a 1-block square town with a bus station and a post office and about 5 supermarkets. It's primarily an Indo-Fijian sugarcane farming community. It was purposefully chosen. We sampled 114 households, representing 215 school-aged children. On average, the fertility is 3 children per mom, and moms have about 9 years of education. The urban site is Suva, which is the capital city. 220 households were sampled. This yielded 368 school-aged children. The average fertility is significantly lower, and the average education is significantly higher. That's sort of the overall data pool, but I'm going to talk just about a subset of that data. 306 children. The sample represents 1 child per household, the eldest child for which a 24-hour dietary recall was available, and it was the eldest child in most of these, but if a child or mother self-reported that the previous day's diet was non-normal, it was excluded from the analysis because we were trying to get normal dietary variation, and we combine that with household data from the larger survey. So to try and answer the question, what motivates dietary choices in urban areas, and if it is associated with some sort of parental investment motive, I started out by saying I have 300 or so kids. I know what they ate, but instead of saying I'm going to compare urban and rural households to see what the significant differences are, I actually wanted to see if there were significant differences and where they were in areas that I might not have expected that. So I took that dietary data, did a food analysis, and then took the raw results and put them into a data reduction program, did a cluster analysis, hierarchical clustering, to see what foods varied significantly between these environments and let the foods sort into their natural categories. The cluster analysis yielded 2 main clusters, and what I show you here is the different groupings of food, the F values. All of these are significant, and the unadjusted caloric intake, mean caloric intake per food group. There were significant differences across what I clustered, and after doing the cluster and seeing that I had 2 relatively equally sized groups that varied on many of the factors that the literature would lead you to believe they should vary on, I used those 2 groups as the dependent variable in a discriminant analysis. So what I wanted to see, my sort of working hypothesis was that if somehow the urban ecology was what motivates diet change on its own, that the significant predictors of these 2 clusters should be things like living in an urban area and how much money you make. These are often cited in public health literature. So I ran this discriminant analysis. It's a two-group dependent variable discriminant analysis using a variety of continuous and dichotomous variables that I had reason to believe might be predictive. Mother's years of education, household income, the time a mom spends per week related to food activities, cooking, shopping, preparing food, the number of children in the household, BMI, average intake, age, area. And because there is basis in the literature for food preferences developing across your lifetime, I included variables looking at whether childhood residence mattered. If you grow up in the urban area eating urban food, are you just going to eat urban food? Looked at child sex, having a car, electricity, religion, and actually two variables that are not in here are migrant status, whether or not you relocated, and whether or not you're a farmer. So these are the results of the diet clusters. You can see that the two clusters are quite different. My little pointer here. I named them diverse and traditional based on the makeup of the foods that they sorted on. The traditional diet has quite a lot of rice and roti. Roti is a traditional Indian flatbread that's eaten in Fiji. They eat naan as well, but almost exclusively roti, very little puri or naan. So rice, roti, fruits, vegetables, and a decent amount of meat. So this is probably curry right here. With a decent amount of sweetened beverages that includes all sweetened drinks, including Coca-Cola type products, a little bit of bread, little bit of added fat, very little cheese, instant noodles, milk, and some packaged snacks. The group that sorted quite significantly different from that, I called the diverse group. It's a very urban-like group. They're reducing their rice, roti, fruit, and fruit and vegetable intake. They've increased their meat intake, which is something we find in nutrition transition literature. They've increased their intake of things like sweetened soda products. They've increased their bread and butter intake. There's all sorts of added fat, but in Fiji it's primarily bread and butter that people are eating. Starting to eat cheese, starting to eat a lot of instant noodles. We would call them ramen. They would call them Maggi because they're on the Asian side of the world. And a lot of mixed vegetables, milk, and a tremendous increase in the number of sort of prepared snacks, packaged snacks that people are consuming, children are consuming. So, so these two are the dependent variable in the analysis. With the discriminant analysis, I did 3 iterations. Actually, I did 4, but I'm going to show you 3. The first model, I've tried to organize these in a way that makes the final model easier to read. So the first model, I dumped everything in, let everything load, and as just a rule of thumb, loadings above plus or minus 0.4 are strongly predictive. The model fit statistics are here. It's a fine model, it's a significant model, and it has a predictive capacity of almost 64% accuracy, which is actually very acceptable. But there's also a lot of variables in here, especially the variables that have to do with the child itself, age, sex, BMI, that are just completely non-predictive. So I removed everything that wasn't at or nearing 4. And left area and income in because those are particular variables of interest. So model 2 is rerun. The loadings improve on quite a few things. Area and income, though, still flagging below the 0.4 cutoff. And the model fit statistics are good. In fact, the lambda has gone up just a tiny, tiny bit, but the accuracy has gone down. So it's kind of a toss-up as to whether that's a better model. The final model has the 4 predictive elements that are actually quite significant. The model fit improved a bit more, and the predictive accuracy is 64%, which is the highest, but not really different than that first model, which kind of tells me that in that first model, all that junk isn't doing much to begin with. It's just these 4 factors that are predicting group membership. The strongest load is the education of the mother. I did look at the education of the father. The two are correlated, so they can't both be in the model. But mom is a much stronger predictor. Childhood residence. I looked at childhood residence, just did she grow up in the urban or the rural area? And this is coded, one is urban. And looked at dads as well. Again, they're significantly correlated because you tend to marry people, I guess, in your social network. But moms is by far the stronger predictor. Total calories is a significant predictor. The model doesn't change that much without it, though. And being Hindu, and I think it's because Hindus tend to eat less meat, so they may be maintaining something of a more traditional diet, but I'm not certain about that. So what that tells me is that in Fiji, the urban diet is associated, the urban environment is associated with a modified dietary pattern, but it's not exclusive. In fact, it's not the strongest predictor by far, not even a significant predictor. The diet patterns are much more complex than one expects if you approach the problem as an a priori rural-urban dichotomy. Among Indo-Fijians, the strongest predictor of this modified diet is maternal education. And again, that makes me immediately think that there's something going on with the way these educated mothers are going about investing their own resources in their own offspring. Area is a relatively weak predictor. It was not as weak as many of the others, but it certainly was not meeting the threshold of 0.4. And in terms of BMI, so nutrition transition is associated not only with this change in what you're consuming, but a change in overall lifestyle and overweight, obesity, and non-communicable diseases. BMI actually does not differ by cluster. There's no significant, in fact, you'll remember it was one of the first covariates, one of the lowest predictors. But if we look at BMI by mother's education level, there is a very strong difference in, a significant difference in mean BMI between, if you do a mean split, the higher educated and the lower educated mothers. There is a very marginal association between BMI variation between rural-urban areas, but this is the strongest and most significant difference. These clusters also reflect significant differences, I would say, in quality and quantity. Now, these are some variables that were extracted from the larger survey. The modified diet moms have themselves invested in their own education to some point, just in thinking about the time it takes to remain in school. We can assume that they have delayed their own reproduction relative to other mothers as they continued to grow, postpone reproduction while they were growing, growth being investing in their own ecologically relevant skill set, which itself should be related with to those opportunities in the urban area. These moms also seem to be directing resources toward a relatively more quality-based parental investment strategy. I don't have a lot of variables on this, unfortunately, but what I do have are some self-reported and validated variables on the grades that kids earn. And the children of these modified diet moms do seem to do significantly better, marginally significantly better in school than their traditional diet peers. This could be masking some of that other urban-rural variation because school systems do tend to be better in the urban area. But again, that's not a strong predictor as to who falls into which cluster. The diets of these modified kids are higher in calories overall. They're also higher in protein, so they could be potentially a little bit more sustaining throughout a school day. They're also higher in fat, but that is not high enough to result in a significantly higher BMI, mean BMI. In terms of micronutrients, the diets really don't differ that much. Even rural kids, even the kids, pretty much all the kids in the sample are getting mean, decent intake of most micronutrients, a little bit of low iron and a little bit of low calcium in the traditional diet. And in terms of the quantity variable, age-adjusted fertility between these two groups is very significantly different, with modified moms, again, having fewer offspring who seem to be doing better in school, which is one of the only markers I have here for that. Oops, sorry. So just to sort of draw some tentative discussion points, urbanization and education should be related in terms of the urban ecology enhancing the long-term benefits to certain types of parental investments. The urban environment changes the context of parenting, especially for girls. And we do see this in Fiji, actually. We see that secondary school enrollment is currently 9% higher for girls than boys, and it's increasing across the board. And the option for wage employments are also increasing with this urban context for women. Since 1982, wage employment for men has increased by 35%, but 150% for women. And this is in the context of increasing poverty as well and increasing marital dissolution. Fertility in Fiji countrywide is still declining. It's declined much more rapidly among Indo-Fijians than it has Fijians. I would say that overall they are reaching or have reached a demographic transition, with Fijians having plateaued and now starting to decrease again. So fertility countrywide has declined about 1% in the last decade. And I would also say, potentially, that the urban ecology changes dietary choices in terms of parental investment and how especially working or educated moms go about allocating their own resources in an urban ecology in a quality-based parental investment strategy. So again, some pictures of the work that we're doing now with indigenous women. Indian women do not have this sort of labor pattern, nor do they live in this village ecology. They live more in sugarcane farming areas like this. The real question for me isn't, is nutrition transition going on? Is it resulting in higher BMIs? The question for me is why humans choose particular foods. And as behavioral ecologists, we all know that there are strong ecological factors at work in dietary choice. People have particular cultures, particular histories, and they live in particular environmental settings. But in addition to their ecologies, they have individual aspects to their own selves that impact how they behave and how they access and allocate resources. There are costs and benefits to any individual allocation that's going to be different than the allocation decisions of other individuals, and those individual attributes vary tremendously. And in the urban environment where acquiring resources is contingent on formal skills and education, those attributes I think might be key to how parents are going about choosing foods. I guess my tentative conclusion is that mothers might be integrating some novel urban elements to facilitate parental investment strategies. That income and the availability of the types of foods that urban areas have in them may actually enable some of the quality-based parental investment strategy that we seem to see associated with urban environments broadly. Okay, yeah, future directions. So what I want to conclude with is just a brief statement or two about future directions. I don't by any stretch think that this analysis solves the quandary of what's motivating nutrition transition, but I do think that in thinking about something that's termed a global epidemic that is behavioral in its etiology, we need to be thinking about linking dietary decisions with qualitative data on what motivates them. I can give you a lot of quantitative stuff, but it'd be really nice to also have some statements from moms over a long period of time about why they chose Maggi noodles instead of fish curry. And this becomes increasingly interesting to me in the village. So women, this is a woman in the village I'm working in now. She's come home from fishing. These guys have just come home from the farm. Even though this is subsistence foraging or subsistence type farming, low-scale farming, I should say, they have a much easier time given the types of resources available and the infrastructure available in terms of purchasing foods, going to the farm and gathering enough dalo to feed a family for, well, maybe not a week. Fijians eat a lot of dalo, but feed people for quite a while. That to me seems a much easier trade-off to make, because it's energetically expensive potentially, than trying to get money to buy something canned to then feed your family. And in the village, we do see a lot of that going on. And I don't really understand how that makes life easier or convenient or maximizes resources. But clearly, something is motivating those choices. I also think one area that is potentially very necessary for this type of discussion is an investigation of migrant learning strategies. We have some of that in the literature, but what we don't have is migrant learning strategies specifically associated to things like food acquisition. I don't know of anything that really gives the level of detail that in the type of motivational framework that I'm talking about. I think it's also useful for us to understand the heterogeneity in urban and peri-urban food strategies. Most of the nutrition transition literature, again, is broad-based, this is how urban people eat. And urban people are an incredibly heterogeneous bunch, and people in the peri-urban periphery might actually be the ones that we should be looking to actually document the transition that's going on now. Urban food ways are definitely, they've transitioned quite a way. Again, why would a villager prefer to buy canned fish? And what motivates urban people that farm? Have you seen this in Nandi? Huge farms on the side of the road. It's a Fijian thing because of this communal land ownership idea. If someone's not using the land, some people, not all people, but some people, decide to put the work in to start farming even in the urban area. I don't understand what motivates, what individual or ecological factor is motivating some people to buy canned fish and some people to make urban farms, but I would like to. So just a final word, acknowledging everyone that has put so much into this work, my wonderful research assistants for the most part, USP, the Fiji Museum, Donna Leonetti at the University of Washington, and of course our funders, the National Science Foundation. So, thanks.